Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be catching you up on my reading. Throughout the entirety of November, I only read 2 books. Like, I know Christmas is literally in a few days, but I'm still wondering, like, what the hell happened to November? Where did it go? What happened? Did anyone see her? I didn't see her. So throughout the entirety of November, I read 2 books. I do have 10 books to talk to you about today, so the majority of those are books that I read in October, so they do have a slightly seasonal skew. So for all my spooky guys and gals, you're gonna have a great time. And there's a few books in this pile that absolutely slapped. Like, they were straight up bangers. And you know what? I'm not gonna fuck around. I'm gonna go straight in there. I'm gonna deliver one of the bangers. You've probably seen loads of people raving about this book, but I read Her Majesty's Royal Coven by Juno Dawson. Stunning. This was just so much fun. I've read a couple of Juno Dawson books before. I think she's an absolutely wicked writer, and she's an author who I just really want to revisit all of the books that she's already published. Like, she's published so many YA books and I know I'm gonna love them because all of the books I've read from her I have loved, but this is her first foray into adult fiction. So this book is part of, I think, a trilogy. I have already pre-ordered the second book from Waterstones. So Her Majesty's Royal Coven, HMRC, there's a bit of a joke there, is the governmental department for all things witchy. So this is part of like a legacy of witches that dates back to Anne Boleyn, and HMRC is a place for women and girls to develop their talents for witchcraft. There is a male version for warlocks where they can train their skills, but warlocks are on a whole far less powerful than witches are. There is a very dangerous prophecy, and the 4 main witches that we are following in this book are trying to stop this prophecy before it is too late. We also have a very young, powerful witch whose powers and talents emerge throughout the course of this book. At the beginning of this book, this character is treated as if they are a warlock, but later in the book they come out as trans, so they are a trans woman, a trans witch. And there are varying degrees of acceptance of this from the different characters in this book. I think it's obviously very pointed for this to be a topic of discussion in a book that is about witches, and you know, I think those of us who are extremely disappointed and angry at the creator of another witching society would find a lot of value in this book. I know I certainly did. And I thought how that topic was handled was done absolutely superbly, and I wouldn't expect anything different from Juno Dawson, who of course is a trans woman herself. And as well as that, the plot of this book is just really page turning. It feels really epic. I loved how all of the magic systems were explained, how the different witches have the different like particular talents that they have an affinity towards. The ending of this book has divided a lot of people. I really liked the ending. It made me really excited to read the next book. I don't know if maybe that's because I don't read a lot of fantasy, so maybe I found that twist like really exciting, whereas I don't know, maybe if it's like overdone, I don't know, to just sort of change the course of the story in that way. Like, I don't know. So yeah, absolutely loved this. I'm a big Spice Girls fan, so loved all of the Spice Girls references throughout, and very excited to read the next book in this series. While we're on the topic of witches, let's stay in that realm. I read The Witches by Roald Dahl. This was a very cozy reread for me. I read it on Halloween. It definitely brought up a lot of nostalgia for me. I don't feel like I need to go into the plot of this too much. And while this brought up a lot of nostalgia for me, having just read this book, it made me very glad that the representation of witches has evolved a lot since this book, because a lot of it is very questionable, particularly when it comes to bodily difference being used as a shorthand for evil. And I think that's something that if you are gonna reread Roald Dahl's books, there's gonna be stuff like that in there around various sort of differences. So yes, while it definitely conjured those nostalgic feelings, while there was definitely things that I found humorous about the writing, while I can appreciate Roald Dahl's talent for writing for children, a lot of it is just stuff that wouldn't be acceptable now and shouldn't have been accepted when Roald Dahl was writing. And as I said, very grateful for some more contemporary representation of witches in fiction, which you can also find in Precious Catastrophe by Deirdre Sullivan. This is the sequel to Perfectly Preventable Deaths, which I absolutely loved. In the sequel, we are following the same pair of twin sisters that we followed in the first book, Caitlin and Maddie. In the first book, we follow them moving to quite a remote town in Ireland and discovering more about the history of this town and how they are connected to it. We follow one of the sisters entering into a very dangerous romantic relationship, and as the other sister learns more about her powers, she realizes that she's going to have to be the one to save her sister from this situation, which on the surface doesn't look good, but as we delve into the depths of it, realize just how dangerous it is and how the supernatural is at play. And in this sequel, we are following those sisters learning more about each other, how their lives are affected from the very traumatic event that happens at the climax of the previous book. And I think how that metaphor of the supernatural trauma that is experienced translates into real life trauma that so many women experience was done absolutely fantastically. Did really enjoy this book. As always, appreciate the LGBTQ plus representation in there as well. Didn't think it was as strong as the first book in the series, but still really enjoyed it nonetheless. If you love witchy books, I would definitely recommend the series. It's a gay Irish book about witches. I was gonna love it. And let's stick with the supernatural YA. I read Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas. Bookbreak very kindly sent me all of Aidan Thomas's backlist, and I am so excited to read the 2 other books that they've sent me because this book was such a pleasant surprise for me. I was really intrigued to read it because it is LGBTQ plus YA, but this level of fantasy is something that isn't necessarily my comfort zone, and it was such a surprise to me that I absolutely loved this. I read this on a flight to Budapest when I was going on holiday, and I loved it. Like, I could not put it down. So this book is a representation of Latinx culture, but particularly the relationship between that culture and the supernatural, and I loved how the author's heritage was brought into this book. It was something that I hadn't really read before, and I learned a lot from that. Our main character is Yadriel, who is struggling to find acceptance and find his place amongst his family. He is a trans man and isn't quite sure how that will affect the progression of his powers and whether it will at all. And in an effort to prove himself and his powers, he tries to summon his cousin's ghost. But this doesn't go exactly to plan when, instead of summoning the ghost of his cousin, he summons the ghost of the high school's resident bad boy. And things get very messy and complicated as Yadriel tries to figure out what's going on, figure out how this has happened, and what larger forces are at play. And also, there is a romance between Yadriel and the ghost of this bad boy. The chemistry between them felt like so authentic, and like while there's kind of that like initial attraction there, the chemistry builds as these characters get more used to one another and learn more about each other, and a bond forms between them. This book is such a celebration of culture, both Latinx and queer, and of course the intersectional culture between the two of those things. The world is so richly detailed and developed. Loved it, absolutely loved it. What a smash. I also read The Other Ones by Fran Hart. Thank you so much to Chicken House for sending me a copy of this book. I think it's one that I want to reread next Halloween, because if I'm being honest, couldn't really tell you what happened in this book. It's about a group of friends, 2 of which are siblings, that live in a haunted house, and it's a book about banishing ghosts, both literal ghosts and, you know, your inner ghosts. It's about these 4 friends figuring out the haunting at this house, but also figuring out themselves. Maybe it's also gay. I do think I should probably keep hold of this and try reread it next Halloween, because I don't know like what was happening the day that I read it, what has happened to me since, was my memory wiped? That's a possibility, but I honestly just couldn't tell you anything else about this book, so one to reread. Next up is some middle grade, and we're still in this kind of spooky realm. I read The Battle for Perfect by Helena Duggan. This is the 3rd and final book in this trilogy from this Irish author. I really loved A Place Called Perfect, which is the first book in this series. In the year that I read it, I thought it was so fun. I definitely felt it was kind of Tim Burton, Lemony Snicket, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, a melting pot of all of those kind of vibes, like a little bit of Coraline in there as well. And it's in that kind of middle grade vein of weird things happening in a weird town, and none of the adults are particularly helpful. The majority of this book, we are following Violet, who is our protagonist from the first book. In the second book, we went more towards the perspective of Boy. And in this book, the 2 friends find out that there is more trouble brewing in this town. Trouble, specifically meaning a zombie army. I thought this book was very fun, but for me, it didn't live up to the hype of the first book, but very glad to have finished this series nonetheless. Okay, let's now transition out of the spooky books. One of my most anticipated releases for 2022 was People Person by Candice Carty-Williams. You may remember this author as the writer of Queenie, which in the year that I read it, absolutely adored it. I think it was probably my favorite book of that year, so I had very high expectations for People Person, and while it is quite different to Queenie, I absolutely loved it. So in this book, we are following the relationships between 5 half siblings. Well, 2 of them are full siblings, and then the rest are like half siblings. They all share a very irresponsible father. So 5 children, 4 different mothers, the same father. And one day the dad picks them all up to go to a park together, and he basically makes sure that the siblings are introduced to one another so that they don't end up like hooking up when they're older. The siblings don't really stay in touch, although they kind of, see each other in passing. And the eldest sibling makes it very clear that while they may not stay in regular contact, if she is ever needed, she will be on the end of the phone. And one day, Dimple, who is, I don't think the youngest child, but the youngest sister, possibly, she really needs some help. I'm not going to spoil what happens because I know a few people have mentioned it when they're talking about this book, and while it happens really early on, I do think it's a bit of a spoiler to reveal why she needs help. I will say that it's very unexpected. It's a real shift for the novel quite early on. It's real extraordinary circumstances that draw these siblings together and a very chaotic situation for them to deal with. This author has just crafted all of the different relationships so well. All of the characters have so much nuance, even if they are someone that just crops up occasionally, and the relationships between all of them, or the absence of those relationships, is crafted superbly. The dialogue feels so authentic, the family complications feel so authentic, just packed with such emotional intelligence. Really highly recommend this. It's one of my favorite books of the year. Bit more YA fiction now, and transitioning us into Christmas. This is Love in Winter Wonderland by Abiola Bello. This is a book that is published by the publisher that I work at, and this was actually the 3rd time that I read this book. So I read it at manuscript, I read it at proof, and I've read the finished copy. So wholesome, definitely something that you can read in a day. And if you are still looking for some festive, Christmassy reading that is just gooey and fluffy and lovely, then I would definitely point you in the direction of Love in Winter Wonderland because it is just gorgeous. So we are following the romance between Trey and Ariel. Trey is popular, he's handsome, he's swoony, and he works at his parents' bookshop Wonderland. Then we have Ariel, who is a bit more sort of creative. She's quite quirky, she's trying to get into art college, and she is in need of a Christmas job. An opening at Wonderland seems like the perfect answer, but there are also a lot of financial problems at Wonderland. Rents are going up, maintaining this bookshop that is struggling, particularly due to discount stores opening very near to the bookshop. Trey's family are really struggling to sustain the business, and Trey decides that he needs to do something, and his first attempt at raising some money to help save the bookshop doesn't go to plan. It sounds very fun. It's a pink party in the bookshop, but unfortunately it ends up making the situation worse when Ariel and Trey join forces for this common goal. This is a book that is just packed with so much Black joy and celebration. It's a love letter to Hackney, it's a love letter to Black communities, to Black celebration. It's a love letter to bookshops and booksellers. And as someone that works in sales in the publishing industry, I've developed an appreciation for all of the different places that you can get books from, the ecosystem of how all of these different retailers work together. But it has to be said, there is something truly magical about an independent bookshop, about booksellers that truly understand the importance of books and of reading. The simple pitch for this is that it is a gooey, festive romance set in an independent bookshop. I think that pitch is enough to get so many of you reading this book. I know so many of you are gonna love this. It is like stepping in to the best Netflix rom-com that you've ever been in. I hope you guys enjoy this one as much as I did. And finally, I have 2 classics to tell you about. We are kind of going back to the spooky supernatural area. You may remember that a while ago I also did a TBR for Victober, Victorian October, which is a month dedicated to reading more Victorian literature than you normally would. I read 2 Victorian books, so that is more than I would normally read. So I did it. So I read The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. This is a very slim book. It is a novella. This was written in the late 1800s, and it's an exploration of the future of humanity. So we have a Victorian scientist who develops this time machine that takes him extraordinarily far into the future, where a new society has developed. They are descended from humans but more elfin in their characteristics, and initially this seems like a utopian society, but as this scientist learns more about it, he's discovering that that's not the case. The plot of this novel isn't necessarily what I enjoyed about it. What I did really enjoy about it was seeing how this is a precursor to other science fiction that I have read or more likely watched. I don't read a lot of sci-fi. The time machine is something that shows up in a lot of different sci-fi in lots of different forms, so many different interpretations of it, and how the mechanics of it, how it would exactly work, what laws and rules would apply to it. So it was fascinating to see one of its earliest depictions in this novella, and also seeing the concerns of a Victorian society explored and speculated on through the vehicle of science fiction. I also recently went to a science fiction exhibition in the Science Museum in London, and it was really interesting going to that exhibition, having read this and seeing, you know, one of the earliest depictions of time travel. I also read another H.G. Wells book for October, and that was The Invisible Man. In terms of the plot of this, I found it a lot more kind of exciting and pacey. It is that little bit longer, and it's still very much science fiction, but I think more in the kind of horror realm, and there's also like an element of detective fiction in there as well. Like, it feels a bit more of like a mystery than The Time Machine did. So this follows a man named Griffin who arrives at a hotel with his face covered in bandages. You can't see any of his face. He is completely covered and has sunglasses on, and it's assumed that he is an accident victim. But the true reason for this disguise is far more chilling, and it turns out that through a series of experiments that kind of went over my head and I didn't really understand, Griffin has rendered himself invisible, and in his desperation to find an antidote, it begins to corrupt him. As I said, found this one a lot pacier, a lot more page turning. The mystery and horror element definitely helped me get into this in a way that I didn't necessarily get into The Time Machine, although I found it interesting. The actual reading experience of this one I thought was better. Definitely keen to read more H.G. Wells. I've got a few more of his books on my shelf, and I have to say I love a short classic. So that is it. They are all of the books that I'm going to talk about today. Do leave me a comment down below and let me know if you've read any of these and what you thought of them. Very soon I will be doing a little video telling you about what I'm going to be reading for Christmas, but I did want to get this one up and share that with you first. I am going to try and be more regular with videos in the new year. I'm going to try my best. Life has just been a lot recently, and a lot of very, very positive things. If you know, you know. And I think perhaps in the new year it is time we had a proper little catch up, get some hot drinks, have a proper catch up, tell you everything that's been going on. So I'll definitely try and do that in the new year. But that is it for me today. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will speak to you in my next video.